Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me in the wee black box back there? I'm getting a thumbs up. Thank you very much for your translation. It's been very helpful to me, and now those of you who can't understand English get to put your headphones on for my discussion. It's very nice to be here, and I'm going to be talking, in terms of the context of families, I'm going to be talking about fathering, and I used Google Translate for my Portuguese, so don't laugh too much. It's not me, it's Google is the problem, I think. So I've been looking at fathering for quite a long time, and I want to talk about three things, and I may not get to the last thing because the time is limited. First of all, I want to talk about the awkward spaces of fathering. Then I want to talk about emotional mapping that will tie into some of the things we've been hearing about today. And finally, if there's time, I want to talk about sustainable family ethics. And part of what I'll be talking about just came out in a paper published by Gender, Place and Culture just last week. And so if you want more information, let me know and I'll send you a copy of that paper. I'm happy to. So first of all, the awkward spaces of fathering, and I'll go through this quite quickly. I've been working with fathering for about 20 years now, as well as working with children and youth and communities. And as some of you know, I've done work on media as well, and that'll come in just a second. But this is really about media in many ways, and it's about the context and propagation of the idea of the nuclear family, the mythic idea that nonetheless may constrain people's lives. And back in the 1990s, in America in particular, we had various feminist perspectives on the idea of the nuclear family. And one of the ones that was most engaged back then was the idea of spatial entrapment. And we're thinking through the industrial era of the bifurcation of space into public space and private space. And the father was in control of the public space and the mother was in control of the private space. But that was sanitized through the rationale of domestic science. And so there was an attempt in the early 20th century, and this is actually a textbook that my mother had at school when she was a young girl, to teach her the science of being a wife. But the issue in terms of geography is that the man would go off to the public space where he had control, and on the periphery, entrapped, were women, children, elders in private spaces. And so we have this very simple dichotomy, which is obviously problematic, but it picks up on some interesting ideas. Sticking with the Anglo-American theme, we then turn to the idea of American home spaces, and that noted misogynist, Frank Lloyd Wright, who designed what was known as very popular in America, the prairie home style of and I can go into other aspects of Frank Lloyd Wright's speciality, but I won't. What I want to note about his buildings is that the kitchen was always in the center, it was always open, it was the place for the woman, it was the place where everybody else walked through to get somewhere else, okay? And men had their dens and their private spaces, women did not have those spaces. So again, we see this context of the family being talked about by feminists in architecture and in geography through the 1990s. However, we got to think also of what this did for men and what they did in the family. And what we find through the 1920s is that fathers are getting increasingly marginalized within the private domestic sphere. This is from Scotland, and we see little boys like me, and then a little bit older, being surrounded by women and growing up with women. And this created a crisis of masculinity that Bob Connell from Australia and others has talked about, where, and Joe Campbell talked about in terms of his idea of the myths, and young men not growing up with role models, and not understanding how to become men because the father was absent from their lives or marginalized from their lives. And so through the 1990s, we begin to see the patent domestication of men, and we see a call from American scholars to get men back in changing nappies and, or in America, diapers, and getting involved in the home. And we see a bunch of reactionary books from people like David Blackenhorn, this is through the 1990s, and especially David Popenoe, which was a push against feminism. And feminism at that time was saying the only appropriate form of parenting is mothering. And we don't need fathers. Fathers are abusive, they're violent, and they shouldn't be part of it. And if a man wants to be a parent, he should take his lead from mothers. And so in terms of movies and so forth, we get issues of dads being parodied as being useless within the family. Think of Homer Simpson, for example. Okay, I've got to speed up a little bit here. Spencer Rao came out with this very popular, some of you who are as old as me will remember this very popular poster of a young man in Levi's, brawny young man, holding a baby. And Spencer's a great guy, actually. I got this for my book on fathering. I got this, his permission, and there was only a phone number. I called it up, and he said, yeah, this is Spencer. And I went, what? You're kidding. So we had a chat on the phone. He said, of course you can use my graphic. But the point about this is, and this relates to, Clarice was talking about bodies this morning and the importance of bodies in terms of social and spatial reproduction. Bodies are also important in terms of representation and in terms of the larger discourses that we see in the media. And Julie and Kathy Gibson-Graham, when they're writing about economies, talk about the modern economics being grounded in the man's body. Okay, an economic that is organically interconnected, hierarchically organized, and engaged in a process of self-regulating reproduction. It's solid, it's strong, and it's immutable. It's unchanging. It's there for children to rest comfortably in. And so we can be concerned then about the particular roles that men were expected to play as fathers. And so I got involved in this in several ways, not least of which was emotional mappings of fathers and their poetics. And I started 20 years ago with an article that was about my own fathering and talking about some fathers in a National Science Foundation project that I was part of in terms of how fathers don't seem to measure up as parents. And I talked with a bunch of fathers and I interrogated my own actions and how I felt that I wasn't well disposed to being a parent because I didn't, and then there's the whole idea of the natural connection, the more natural connection that women have through the body to children than men do. And I started a project that took 15 years of ethnography that became in 2009 the Awkward Spaces of Fathering. And then the paper that I just wrote that came out in Gender, Place and Culture is this one at the bottom, which I'll be getting to in just a minute, where I'm talking about the political madness of Slovenia in the 1990s and all through today. And I believe that today in Brazil and also in the US, we are in a time of political madness. And so we have to scrutinize how we are showing up for that. So I want to start with the idea of ethnopoetics. And Jorn talked about the idea of cartographic poetics this morning. And I worked with ethnographies, and if you've read ethnographies that are published, and I've published this kind too, where it's bunch of theory, excerpt, quote, bang, 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 gray columns of quotes, and it's so boring. And a lot of us are very interested in engaging the emotions. And so I decided to take my ethnographic transcripts and turn them into poetry. And I want to give you an example that starts off the Awkward Spaces of Fathering book, which maybe I can get published in Portuguese, and you can all buy a copy of that too. So what I have is a poem that I put together with a guy called Tim, and I'm going to play the interview with Tim, and you'll see how it turned up in the poetry. This is a kind of cool methodology that not too many people are using. It's kind of fun. Do we have volume? Okay. Oh. Okay, I need to go back out. I don't have it on the screen here, so I'm having a hard time seeing what I'm doing right now. Is that previous? Previous? No, 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 okay. That one? Thank you. Okay, now I want to turn this on. If I press this, is it going to come on?
And we had to leave him at the hospital. And we basically committed him into the hospital one time when he was cutting himself.
Yeah, yeah.
He says that's the fucking toughest thing I've ever done.
What age was he then?
Close to the same age as Zach.
13?
Yeah, maybe 14.
Yeah.
Because he never 14 or 15. Because maybe he was a freshman in high school. Yeah.
Was this? I haven't heard that part of your story. Was this something that he was that you knew he was doing, or you?
I think carved the word "fuck" into his leg.
Really?
That was all part of him. He nothing made him happy. We made it out a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and I remember dragging him. Remember, I was trying to get him to go to school or something, and Vicki had left, and I was told by the psychologist to call 911 or call the sheriff if he wouldn't do this or didn't do that. And I remember dragging his ass from his bedroom out into the living room. Because he'd just sit there like this with his legs folded. And
Okay, so that was me talking to Tim, and what you aren't able to see there is that he's crying in the middle of that. The tears are running down his face, and by the end of the interview, I'm crying too. And he and I crafted this poetry together, changed the words around a little bit, but used it as far as we could, his own exact words. And so I took this method of ethnopoetics, and we started creating story maps, basically, but using Google Earth. Lorraine was talking about story mappings from Esri in their software earlier this afternoon. We just use Google Earth, and we create this poetry. I don't have time to go into this. I have publications on this stuff I'm happy to send to anyone. We went to China, and we took this to China, and we were going to use Esri's story mapping, but we were going into these remote villages that did not have any cellular connection, so we couldn't. So we would download Google Earth caches, and then we'd have the young people teach the old people about about creating these maps. And this is an example of one of the maps that shows up. And I'm not going to do it because I don't have time, but you can click on these images and you see the interviews. These are my field notes. And you can see the Mandarin is a very poetic language. So this young man goes for a walk with his grandfather into the mountains where it is pure, clear, and unfettered. This young man went to school. He went 40 kilometers to school. He walked 40 kilometers every Sunday to school, was in boarding school until Friday, then he walked 40 kilometers home. And he walked down this way. This is his village where he would return. Here in the village, true emotions accumulate over years. Isn't that beautiful? You know, and so we're working with this language and with these grandfathers and fathers and young people in what someone said in the last, it's like a co-production of their spatial stories. So let me move very quickly from China over to Slovenia and talk a little bit about the political madness that was going on in Slovenia. And those of you who nicely picked up the book yesterday. This is for you, Annette. I talk about the children in this book, primarily, and their activism. And in the paper that anyone wants, I talk about the fathers and their relationality and interdependence within that activism. But very quickly, we have in 1990, let me go to the Portuguese version. We have in 1990, Slovenia gets its independence. And if you live in Slovenia, you had an opportunity to become a citizen. They didn't, but if you were an ethnic minority living in Slovenia, like you were Serbian, Croatian, Montenegrin, you had to sign up in order to get your Slovenian citizenship. They didn't advertise this too much. And 35,761 ethnic minorities, Roma as well, didn't sign up because they didn't think it was that important. And they immediately lost their citizenship, well, not their citizenship, but their residential status, their permanent residential status. And by so doing, they lost access to housing, to education, kids couldn't go to school, to employment of any kind. You couldn't get married because you didn't have the documentation. And so they were called the izbrisani in Slovenian, which means the erased. The erased. And so I worked with some of these people and tried to create stories of their relationships. This is Alexander Todorovic, who started the erased movement. And what I'm getting to here is that these people came together politically to push back against their erasure. And the Gibson Grahams talk about community economies and how people can come together and push back against capitalism through local community economies. I take their work and talk about political communities, and in many places they start in the family. And they start with fathers, mothers, and the mothers were very active as well, not just the fathers. And Alexander Todorovic is quoted as saying, why did he start the hunger strike? Why did he start the movement? And he says, well, I don't know, I felt like an amoeba. I felt like nothing, I had nothing to lose. And so this relates to Giorgio Agamben's idea of zoopoliticus, the idea of the erasure of political content to your life, so you are just an amoeba, you are nothing. And Alexander Todorovic knew nothing about that, but he talked about this idea of zoopoliticus when he talked about being an amoeba, nothing left to lose. And nonetheless, he's still part of a family. So on the right is Alexandra Todorovic, his daughter. And unfortunately, Alexander died when we were there. He killed himself, and I haven't time to go into that story. But let me see if I can get, it's in Slovenian anyway. So you guys back there, you're going to be translating Slovenian through English into Portuguese, yeah? No, they're not going to do that.
Ona pač mu to vse prepisovala, rečemo, njega učila, ne vem, vedno mu je stala ob strani, samo pol pač je bilo dovolj, pa je.
So you get the sense of the tension that happens here. Now, Alexander Todorovic and a lot of the Serbians were the fathers of these children, and all of a sudden, they're enemies of the state. These children have been born in Slovenia, and they've been raised speaking Slovenian, not Serbian, and all of a sudden, they are enemies of the state because their fathers are enemies of the state, and they are erased also. And they can no longer go to school, and they lose all their friends, they get bullied, and so forth. And so we get this interesting kind of context of tension within families that the Todorovics were certainly part of, although Alexandra is very proud of her father, and she's following in his activist footsteps. This father talks about coming to, so that was in Ljubljana, and we're now in Koper, which is on the Adriatic right here, right beside Italy. And this father here came and he did everything right. And he went and he gave his documents to the authorities, and they immediately punched them as void and gave him new documents. I don't know if you can see this, but there's 6 zeros at the end there. That means you weren't born anywhere, you have no parents, you are a non-person. You imagine having your passport ID with 00000. That's what they did. You are a non-person. Zoopoliticus. Okay? And so his daughter, Tanya, was part of a panel that we put together of erased children. And I want to play this for you. It's in Slovenian, but I want to play it for you because I want you to get, if you can, the emotions. Because she's, and you see what she's saying here below. Watch her.
Je prišla ena gospa, in to se mi zdela, da je socialnega dela. So mojim staršem rekli, da naj se to zrihta, to ne dobimo državljanstvo, ker če ne nam bojo pač, da bi jim vzeli te otroke, da bi nas dali strah.
Просто каква и Тања, да отлака да уреju. Да родини, to nije samo...
Okay, so, I mean, Tanya's crying there at the end of that, and she's crying because she was called a refugee, and you notice, so Dad came immediately and took measures, and they were all afraid and went away. So there's some importance, I think, in terms of the older tropes of masculinity and protection that are here as well. But I spent some time with the dads, and they're crying too, they're very emotional, and the point about this is that we don't have rugged individualism for these fathers necessarily, except when needed. I'm going to skip this story because I'm getting out of time, but if you want to read about it, that's great. This was someone who was trying to get back into Slovenia who was erased and locked out of his own country and couldn't get back. And I want to get back, as I finish now, to thinking about this idea of solid, strong, and immutable. And I think those are okay, and we shouldn't throw them out as being masculinist or patriarchal because they serve a purpose sometimes for men to be defending their family and drawing a line. But I think we should also think about the affective, what is it a father does? When we talk about affectivity, what is it a father does? And how that fathering changes over time. It doesn't stay the same. And we should think about the relationality between fathers and children. And we should think about immanence rather than transcendence. This is not about something that comes from the media or comes from outside. It starts in the family, and the family becomes a basis for a pushback against political madness. And also understanding that there are contradictions here. There was great tension within many of these families, as we saw with Alexander Todorovich's family. Because of the pressure he was at, he brought that back into the family, which was not good for the family at certain times. And everything is always changing. So in my last minute, I'm out of time. I'm going to finish there. If you're really interested in sustainable ethics, read Rosie Bridotti's Posthumanism. That's where I'm going next. Stay tuned.